Did this Doctor Who sequel episode work, or did it fail? So obviously the third episode of Doctor Who Season 2, The Well, has recently aired, but before I get into it, even though all of my reviews are full of spoilers, I particularly want to give a spoiler warning for this episode just in case. So if you haven't seen this episode yet, this isn't a spoiler-free review, so if you don't want spoilers for this episode and for some reason you haven't already seen the episode before watching this, watch the episode first and then come back to this review, because it's going to be full of spoilers right off the bat. So with that being said, before this episode aired, I had heard speculation that this episode would be a sequel to Midnight. Apparently it had been leaked beforehand, and I had actually discussed this theory in a video previously. Before I actually believed it and before I realised it was from a leak, I thought it was just some speculation about the episode. And like I said, when I first mentioned it, I didn't actually believe it to be true. If anything, I was thinking this episode was going to be a sequel to maybe something like The Impossible Planet and Satan Pit or something like that. But I did start to believe this theory more as time went on, and so as such I started to mention this theory less, because I think I found out it was a leak and was seeming more and more likely, so I didn't want to spoil it for as many people, even though I had already mentioned it at some point, which I do feel kind of bad for now. But bear in mind, this was when I wasn't sure if it was a leak or even sure if it was true. But even with that being said, even with it being leaked, there were still maybe too many hints that kind of confirmed the leak before this episode came out, such as the little hint in the title reveal with the clock turning to midnight, and RTD saying in the first episode of Unleashed that there would be an unexpected sequel in this season. So obviously they couldn't have predicted that the premise of this episode would have leaked online, but surely in the back of their head they should have maybe thought that that could happen and could be a possibility, and maybe shouldn't have hinted at it more to kind of confirm it before it happened. Because it would have been nice, even if maybe there was some speculation about it being a Midnight sequel, that we still weren't 100% sure when it got round to it, when the episode aired, and we could still be thinking, is that true, or is this going to be something new, something else? So going into this being kind of 80% sure that it was a Midnight sequel, I was cautiously intrigued about this episode, but worried that it wouldn't work or they would reveal too much. So does this Midnight sequel work, and is it better than Midnight? Before we get into that review, I just want to mention, in celebration of Doctor Who Season 2 airing, I currently have a discount on my Patreon for 50% off your first month of any paid tier on my Patreon page when you use code SEASON2. So I'll make sure to have the Patreon linked in the description down below, but that's just a little discount I'm running in celebration of Doctor Who Season 2. And without further ado, let's get back into the review. Okay, so right off the bat, I'm glad they're still continuing with each episode flowing into the next episode. Obviously, this one takes place immediately after Lux. They're still in the same outfits, just like how last episode immediately took place after the Robot Revolution. I like this more serialized feel to the series, especially with it only being an 8-episode season now, which I think would have worked well for last season as well, instead of having the 6-month time jump that we got in the Devil's Cord. And we also obviously still have some references to the overarching story of this season, with mentions of Earth and the other characters who should know what Earth is, having never heard of it. But the big question I have about this cold open is, how did they happen to get changed into the exact same spacesuits that everybody else had? Even down to the helmets automatically sealing so that they are protected, and having those kind of propulsion systems in that stop them or help them land when they're landing on the surface. So spoilers for the rest of this review, but this is probably my main issue with this episode, because it did really take me out of the episode. Maybe this could have been a good excuse to bring back the orange spacesuits, because then every modern Doctor besides 9 would have worn it, and it wouldn't have taken me out of the episode as much as it did. But like I said, that's like the main issue I have with this episode, and it is kind of a nitpick, although it did take me out of the episode when it happened. And technically we do still get a return of the orange spacesuits, because they have a repainted helmet from the orange spacesuit at the end of the episode that Aliss is wearing when she's leaving this colony mine. Also, the placement of the titles felt a bit off and abrupt to me. I can't really explain why, it just felt a bit sudden and out of place, but I suppose there isn't really anywhere else they could have put the titles in this episode, unless maybe they saved it for the reveal in the middle of the episode, which would have been a very interesting idea, but it probably would have worked even less, as the rest of the episode would have felt like it wrapped up a bit too quick if they did that. So I suppose there wasn't really anywhere else they could have put the titles, but the placement of it did seem a bit weird to me. Obviously, Varada Sethu is still great as Belinda in this episode. I've been really enjoying her as a character so far. I think she's a great companion. We obviously get more of her wanting to get home, but now trusting the Doctor more, as well as more mentions conversations of her parents back home, which we got last episode as well. And this episode is a great chance to show Belinda's nursing skills, but there is a moment where the doctor diagnoses someone instead of her doing it, which I thought was a little bit odd. I also think this is a great opening to the episode. It starts as just a mysterious horror base under siege episode, kind of like the Alien movies or The Thing or something like that. And if the reveal of this episode hadn't been leaked, that would have made the reveal feel even more shocking, as this episode would have maybe seemed more by the numbers than it actually was. Rose Ayling-Ellis was a great supporting character in this episode as Alice Fenley, and we also have the whole thing of Alice being deaf and using sign language and subtitles, which I thought was a fun inclusion to this episode. I think this was a good addition to the story and a great bit of inclusivity, as it doesn't feel like Alice being deaf is the focus of the story. Alice just happens to be deaf, and it still affects the story by making everything more difficult to deal with, but it isn't the focus of the story, which I really appreciated. And obviously, the Midnight Entity returns in this episode, and even though I was 90% sure this was going to be a sequel to Midnight before watching it because it leaked before, that reveal still really worked for me personally. I thought it was done really well, and it was giving me similar vibes to when I first watched The Legend of Ruby Sunday and they had the Sutek twist at the end, which obviously Empire of Death didn't quite land for me as much, but that initial reveal at the end of Legend of Ruby Sunday really worked for me, and this was very similar in this episode. Now, I was worried about the Midnight Entity returning. My original speculation from that last shot of the Next Time trailer we got last week made me think that we were going to see the Midnight Entity doing the same thing again, because that shot looked very similar to when the 10th Doctor was possessed by the Midnight Entity in Midnight. So I was worried that the Midnight Entity would just act the same as before, just in a different location, but luckily they did something different with it in this episode. Likely because, at least from what RTD suggests in Unleashed, this wasn't originally intended to be a Midnight sequel when it was first written. It seems like originally this episode was likely written as a completely original monster by Sharma Angel Warfall, but then RTD realised it could suit the Midnight Entity and rewrote some of the parts for it to fit that, hence why he has a co-writing credit in this instead of it just being written by him or just being written by Sharma Angel Warfall. Although that does make me think how much of this was written by Russell, because I would have assumed that this episode was mostly written by Sharma and that Russell just came in to add some of the Midnight stuff, but I do believe he had top billing for writing credits in this episode, so maybe he ended up rewriting most of the story. I'm not really sure. But personally, I think this still works for me as it fits with what the Midnight Entity would do, but it's just messing with them in a different way to what it did before. I'm glad they also didn't show us what it looked like or reveal too much about it. Obviously, if you pause it at the right moments, or if you watched Unleashed, you can basically see what the Midnight Entity does look like in this episode. But for the episode itself, it does really work. And like Russell said in Unleashed, if you're going to do a sequel to any story, it shouldn't be Midnight, because you could easily mess it up and taint the original story, like they did with Pyramids of Mars last year. But luckily, I think they did this really well and pulled it off. Also, unless I'm understanding the mechanics wrong, there is a moment where Alice does a full 360 when she's saying "I'm clean" to the rest of the troopers, which I would have thought would have killed everyone following the rules of this monster. But like I say, maybe I'm misunderstanding the mechanics of this monster. Maybe she has to stand still for a little bit for it to work, or maybe it was just an in-the-moment acting decision that they didn't really pick up on. Also, the line "if it was a clock face, you die at midnight" was a little bit too on the nose for me personally, but I know it worked for a lot of people. At first, I was a little bit confused about how they resolved the plot with the Midnight Entity. I didn't quite understand how looking at itself defeated it, but on second watch, I did hear the line, "if the thing behind it is destroyed, what if the thing behind it is itself?" And so that did kind of work for me when I realised what they were getting at and what they were trying to do, but at first I thought that it was just the creature looking at itself, and that somehow defeated it. So on first watch, it didn't quite work for me, but like I say, I kind of understood it after the second time. I also like how this was set up earlier on in the episode with how good of a shot Shaya is, or Shaya, I can't remember exactly how you say her name, which also comes back later on in the episode when the Midnight Entity possesses Belinda. And I also think them having to wait for the airlock and someone getting possessed is very well set up by the fact that when they first arrive, it's established that the airlock can only fit in 6 people at a time. And the Midnight Entity possessing Belinda at the end of this story was a nice twist that doesn't really last for very long, but I think it still works. And Shaya sacrificing herself to save them is also a very nice moment. This is probably my least favourite Mrs. Flood cameo in this season so far, because if an older woman showing up in every episode isn't already similar enough to last year's Susan Triad mystery, this particular instance of it immediately made me think of Susan Triad showing up on the monitor in Space Babies. And it also just feels very different to previous Mrs. Flood cameos, but maybe this will make sense when we find out who she really is. So let me know your thoughts on who you think Mrs. Flood might be in the comments down below. Personally, I think this episode could have ended with the zooming out shot of the Doctor and Belinda in the TARDIS when they're lying on the TARDIS floor, but then I suppose we wouldn't have had the tease of the Midnight Entity surviving and the Mrs. Flood cameo at the end, which they seem to be trying to make sure is in every episode for this season. I just personally think it would have been a better emotional moment to end this episode on, especially considering this episode seems to be overrunning a little bit in comparison to the other episodes this season, with this episode being around 48 minutes long and the rest of them being around 45 minutes or less. Overall, The Well is a great tense horror episode of Doctor Who, and a sequel to an episode so great that it probably shouldn't be touched, yet luckily it still works. This is likely thanks to them not giving too much away about the Midnight Entity and doing something different with it. Now, could this have maybe worked better if it wasn't the Midnight Entity and was a brand new monster? Probably, but I personally still think it works as it's still very in character for the Midnight Entity, just messing with them in a different way. As much as I liked Lux last week, I think this is probably the best episode of the season so far. However, the story in the engine is still my most anticipated episode, and next week's Dr. Light story in Lucky Day looks very intriguing. With that being said, I don't think this is anywhere near as good as Midnight, but Midnight is one of my favourite episodes of all time, probably in my top 3, so I wasn't expecting this to surpass that. But like I said, I still really enjoyed this episode, and it's probably my favourite episode of the season so far. But let me know what you think about this episode in the comments down below. And before this video ends, I'd just like to give a shout out to my patrons JB, Tom Baker, Lewis, Andy Collin, flippredd, theunquest, James Box, Oliver Underwood, TheBeastBoss, and LukeN.B.N. These are all free members who, along with getting their names read out here, also get some behind the scenes updates such as thumbnail previews and a free monthly newsletter. To get your name read out at the start of videos, as well as getting early access to videos and exclusive content, you can join as a paid member. And in celebration of Doctor Who Season 2, I'm currently running a 50% discount off your first month on any tier if you use code Season2. I'll make sure to have my Patreon linked in the description down below, so subscribe to the channel and thanks for watching.